When I walked into that living room on Thanksgiving afternoon and saw them, my sister laughing at something my ex had just said, hands almost touching on the arm of the sofa where I used to sit. The floor fell out from under me so fast, I thought I might never stand up again. I remember the light through the windows, the way the turkey steam blurred into everything, and the exact sound of my own shoes as I stopped at the doorway because, for a fraction of a second, I couldn't tell whether my eyes were playing a trick on me or whether my life had simply been replaced while I wasn't looking. You don't ever expect the people you love to become the people who hurt you the worst, and yet there they were, smiling in public like conspirators and apologizing like actors when the camera wasn't on. If you want to understand why I did what I did, you have to understand where I came from. Growing up in the suburbs of Minneapolis, our family was the kind of household that made movies about suburban happiness. Saturday soccer games, backyard barbecues, a fringe plastered with school photos and award ribbons. We were close, really close. We argued sometimes, yes, but even the arguments had this undercurrent of, we're family, we'll come back. My brother, always quiet, the one who would slice the last piece of pizza in half without being asked. My sister, 3 years younger, with that bright laugh that could cut through any bad mood. Mom and Dad, who, to my teenage eyes, seemed as immovable as oak trees. We all went to the University of Minnesota. It was expected, familiar, safe. I never felt lonely with them around. Then I met Jason during sophomore year. He was older, an easy smile, a laugh that made people feel like they were allowed to relax. He made me feel like someone had finally turned down the noise in my head. We fell into each other in the soft textbook way that college kids do. Too much faith in forever, too little suspicion about the small fissures that widen into chasms. We moved in together after graduation, shared a cramped apartment with 2 succulents and a stack of library books. I proposed last December because the future with him felt obvious, like the fall weather, certain and inevitable. He said yes. And then in April of that year, everything I had assumed about loyalty and love and my place in my family was stripped away from me like bark from a tree in a storm. I came home early from work because my sister had texted and said she wanted to borrow my favorite blanket. Who asks to borrow someone's blanket? Only someone who knows exactly how to find comfort in another's things. I remember the hollow in my chest when I unlocked the door and heard voices, laughter, the kind that meant privacy, the kind that meant 2 people belonging to each other. I didn't even make it to the couch. I found them in my bed. I don't recount that moment to be dramatic. I'm telling you it because the way the world rearranged after it is important. I saw them there, her hand tangled in the sheet, his face turned toward her, and my mouth didn't know how to form a word. I remember the heat in my palms as I reached for my phone and the sound of my heartbeat like a drumline in the empty rooms. I screamed. I don't know what else to call it. It was an animal sound that had nothing to do with words. I grabbed him, shoved him, told him to get out. He left. He came back to apologize. He came back to say he had fallen in love with my sister over the years and that he couldn't help who he felt. He said it like an excuse, and he wrapped it in soft tones that made his confession sound almost like a tragedy rather than a betrayal. The worst part was he made it sound inevitable, not a choice. My feelings toward my sister were complex then, in the way that sibling relationships always are, threaded with years of shared jokes and fights over bathroom time and clothes. So there was this weird, aching grief over the loss of the version of her I thought I knew. My parents at first took my side. Mom was furious. Dad was quiet and then very direct. They banned my sister from events until we could heal, and for a while I thought we might. I blocked him and my sister. I cut them out of my digital life and tried to stitch myself back together. I started seeing a therapist. The house felt emptier. But in that quiet, there was a kind of protection, a wound being allowed to scab over when no one was picking at it. Then my work changed everything. In the way it sometimes does when you're finally given a ladder after climbing a long, hollow staircase. My boss, someone who noticed when I stayed late and actually completed projects that others half finished, called me into his office and asked me if I'd be willing to move to Chicago to lead a failing satellite team. They wanted someone from headquarters to take over and rebuild the place. It wasn't glamorous. It was the kind of merciless, scracky leadership that demanded hours and teeth. But it was something I'd only ever dreamed of. Trust, responsibility, a fresh start. The timing felt like a sign. I could leave the betrayal, the betrayed life, the stained bed, all of it, and be someone else somewhere else. The plan was simple enough. I'd tell them at Thanksgiving. We'd talk. We'd maybe, hopefully, knit up the torn edges. I'd spend Christmas at home one last time and move after the holiday. Instead, what happened at Thanksgiving made me understand that betrayal doesn't always end in the bedroom. Sometimes it continues in the living room with casseroles and church lady smiles. I pulled into my parents' driveway and stepped out of the car into the usual chaos. Cousins running to and fro, the smell of yeast and sage. I didn't even notice my sister's car until I was inside the house. Then I saw them, and every muscle in my body clenched. My mother called me into the living room where, like a terrible scene cut from a play, my sister and Jason sat with my aunt and smiled in that way people smile when they're rehearsed. They all looked at me, and my mother, bless her, tried to make it a lesson about family and forgiveness. She said, "We hate that the family is split, but you need to work toward forgiveness." My brother sat closer to them. My parents asked me, gently, to forgive. They told me that families bend, not break. My sister and Jason whispered apologies that sounded like lines from a script. I turned and walked out. I didn't want to be here while they decided I needed to make the moves that would salvage their peace. I didn't want to be the woman who had to swallow her own indignation to keep everyone comfortable. I remember sitting in my car in the driveway and thinking about which part of me belonged to them that they could just request back. I drove to McDonald's and ate a sad, cold Thanksgiving sandwich, and then I decided on one option that felt both like an act of survival and a thin, sharp kind of revenge. I would leave. Leaving wasn't some irrational, impulsive desertion. It was carefully, quietly planned. I had savings, not extravagant, but enough to start over. I had the job. I told my boss I wanted to move earlier. I called the landlord of an apartment I was hoping to rent in Chicago, and we arranged for an early move-in. I switched my phone plan, got a new number, blocked them from everything, and booked a flight. December 15th, I woke up and left. I left a note in the mailbox for my parents that said something simple. I needed to live my life, and I was doing it somewhere else. I didn't include the anger. I didn't include the pleading. There was a discipline to silence that felt like power. If you can't see me, you can't hurt me. The first weeks in Chicago were raw and electric. The city has this way of swallowing you whole and then giving you new bones. I found an apartment with creaky floors and a balcony that looked over a brick alley. I learned the CTA system and the rhythm of morning people buried in newspapers. Work was all-consuming. Meetings, late nights, coffee that tasted like capitalism. I threw myself at rebuilding a career that reminded me I was more than someone's girlfriend, more than someone's sister, more than the body on which someone else tried to play house. My grief and my anger shaped a certain efficiency and edge in me. If revenge is to be had, it starts with not being the wrecking ball someone expects. You might be asking, isn't that enough? Isn't leaving enough? And here's where audiences split, right? Some people will say cutting toxic people out is revenge enough. Others look for the dramatic reveal, the final humiliation, the viral moment. I thought leaving was enough for a long time. For the first months, it was. I changed my number, I blocked accounts, I changed my routines. But grief has layers, and so does anger. At night, sometimes I would lie awake and think about how easily they'd stepped back into the household as if they had been handed my place in it by default. How had they convinced everyone, particularly my parents, that I, the one who had been wronged, needed to be the one to bend? How had they washed their hands with polite apologies and remained invited? One night, I found myself at a coffee shop staring at my phone, and I thought, the real power isn't in getting even with someone the way they get even with someone else. The real power is in making the people who harmed you accountable in a way they can't maneuver away from. The kind of accountability that doesn't rely on revenge porn or revenge plots. The kind that uses their own words and actions against them. The plan, if it deserves to be called a plan, was like this. Gather evidence. Build a timeline. Make the truth undeniable to the people they used as shields. If my parents, my aunt, even my brother had been persuaded by sweetness and performative remorse, the only way to reach them was to make the truth impossible to ignore, not as a screaming confrontation, but as a carefully documented case. I'm not proud of how methodical it sounds when you say it out loud, but there was also a practical cruelty in it. I had to be careful because I didn't want to become someone who harmed for harm's sake. I wanted to make them feel the consequences of their choices. So I started keeping things, screenshots of texts Jason had sent me during lighter times, archived emails, the small inconsistencies in my sister's stories. I'd saved the voicemail where he first told me that his feelings had changed. He was apologetic, but he also explained, in that tone of someone rationalizing an affair, that this had grown over time. These were artifacts, not salacious, not private in an exploitative way, just evidence. Evidence of intent, of pattern, of replacement. I made copies. I organized them by date and by person. This is where it gets tricky. And here's where you have to trust me when I say revenge isn't a neat cinematic montage. There were obstacles. First, my conscience. There were nights when I would stare at the files and ask myself whether I was stooping to their level. Was I proving anything except that two people had been foolish? My therapist would say, you have a right to set boundaries and protect yourself. That was true. But revenge is seductive. The second obstacle was logistics, getting everyone's attention in a way that would make them read, really read, what had happened. I'd cut them off, yes, but I still wanted my parents to understand. My sister's plan of apologies was about as shallow as a puddle. It only took one family member to get soaked through to get everyone else moving back to the old flow. I needed to break that current. Then there were close calls, small things that could have unraveled everything. My brother calling me one night from a blocked number and saying, please just come home. And I had to crush the urge to pack a bag and drive 3 hours because that would have undone my plan to be independent. Or the time I saw my sister at a grocery store over a video on her public account where she was smiling and it felt like someone had smeared salt into the wound. There were days I thought about running back to Minnesota and begging for forgiveness, the kind of desire that smells like weakness, but is really just exhaustion. So I kept working, I kept saving, and little by little, I saw results in my job. Numbers improved, the Chicago office stopped hemorrhaging clients, and we started to get attention from corporate. I found friends, people who didn't know my history and thereby didn't define me by it. I dated a little, made a few shaky attempts at putting myself out there. None of that erased the ache, but it made me stronger. The revenge I started to build wasn't about hurting them physically or financially. It was about removing their ability to dismiss me as the unreasonable one. It was about forcing them to confront the truth using their own words. The opportunity to put my plan into action arrived like most things in life, not as a thunderclap, but as an opening you have to step into before it closes. I was at a holiday networking event in December when the email came through from a family friend who didn't know they'd been blocked. She wrote in a tone of casual concern, asking if I was going to come home for Christmas. Her message was innocent in tone, but honest in content. My parents had been asking around for me. My silence had not been unnoticed. This was the moment to decide whether to run back to my old life or to present them with the thing I had been building, an undeniable record of what had happened, offered in a format they couldn't just shrug at as like kids being kids. I worked with a woman I met at work named Elena, who by coincidence had a background in communications and a ruthless sense of fairness. I didn't tell her everything at first. You don't tell strangers a group's deepest wounds before you know if they can be trusted. But when I told her the gist, that my family had been gaslighting me into forgiving a betrayal, she didn't blink. She knew about narrative. She knew that when people are told a version of events for long enough, the version becomes truth. She said, "We'll do this like a case simply. We make the timeline, we put the evidence where it can't be missed, and then we let people decide." We made a plan that had nothing to do with public shaming and everything to do with visibility. I wasn't looking to destroy anyone's life. I wanted to make sure the people who had been complicit through silence or complicity could see the facts laid out plainly and decide what to do with them. We compiled texts, voicemails, dates of when things happened. We arranged them into a clear chronological narrative with timestamps and context. There were messages from Jason where he apologized and then pivoted to explanations. There were messages from my sister that were small at first, the kind of affectionate notes that mean nothing until you see them across a timeline. We transcribed voices. We made a PDF that read like a case file, not accusatory, but factual. We used only what I had, no illegal recordings, nothing fabricated, just my stash of painful truth. Then came the execution, which was as petty and as dignified as I could manage. I sent the file to everyone in my parents' immediate circle. My parents, my brother, my aunt, some cousins who had been at the house that Thanksgiving, and a couple of family friends I knew would actually read it. I sent it anonymously at first because I wanted them to read it with fresh eyes rather than with the excuse that, well, she's bitter. The email subject line was simple: timeline of events you might want to know. The body was a short note. You always believed in family. I thought you might want all the facts. It went out on a gray December morning, and then I did what every person in my situation does when they have done something that might be interpreted as cruel. I waited. Waiting is torture. But here's what I learned. People prefer narratives that minimize discomfort. They want relationships to last because it's easier that way. So, when the file hit inboxes, the first reactions were defensive. My mother texted, "Who is this? And why now?" I waited. My brother called me from a blocked number and asked, "Are you okay?" I didn't answer. A week passed. Then things began to happen. My cousin, the one who had been closest to my sister in high school, sent a message to my mother that read, "I read this. I think there's more here than we've been told." My aunt, who had been smiling politely that Thanksgiving, texted, "When can we talk?" That call was the moment I had wanted, not because I wanted to gloat, but because when I began to explain, they couldn't so easily fold into the old story of forgiveness. When you have a timeline and voice messages and timestamps, forgiveness becomes not a moral demand, but a choice made with eyes open. Now, the real climax didn't play out with shouting or violence. It was quieter and, to me, much harder. My father, the oak tree, finally said he needed time to process. My mother was devastated, not because she didn't love her children, but because she had been the architect of family peace for so long that the idea of discord felt like a failure. My brother was the most heartbreaking. He'd been so complicit by doing nothing that reading the evidence changed him. He called me one night after everyone else had gone to bed and left me a voicemail filled with the kind of regret that has no remedy. He said, "I should have said something. I thought it would blow over. I'm sorry." My sister tried to reach out through a mutual friend. Jason texted, "We need to talk." My mother's new account DM'd me on Instagram begging me to come home for Christmas, saying she missed me and that the family needed me. I had to decide, in that cold December that felt like a crucible, whether my revenge would be the blowing open of secrets or the steady, undeniable proof that I could survive and even thrive without them. I chose both. I chose in phases to show them how my life could be better without their permission. I accepted a promotion at work, one that meant more responsibility and more visibility. I changed the email signature than my company to reflect my full name without the little hint of shame I'd let stick to me. I started to travel for work in ways I never had. I dated casually and in the process learned how to accept tenderness without suspicion. I took ballroom dance classes, absurd and humbling, and laughed at myself when I stepped on someone's toes. I sent postcards to the people who had reached out in genuine curiosity, not gloating, just updates. I am well. I am working. I miss the things that were good. The downfall for my sister and Jason didn't arrive like a cinematic arrest. It arrived like reputation erosion. And in our family, reputation mattered. The people who had once blanketed their misdeeds with dinner invites and closeted forgiveness found themselves having to re-explain choices to neighbors, to small social circles, to people who'd known them in high school. Friends began asking questions. My aunt, who had been the mediator, felt used and frightened. My sister's boyfriend, someone else entirely, started to notice that she was different in public and made comments that hinted at unease. Jason, who had been assured by the softness of our local scene that his actions would be forgiven, found some doors closed. He was passed over for a promotion. He couldn't convince people he was a tragic romantic rather than someone who'd walked into a family and rearranged it. I need to be careful here, because when people ask for revenge stories, they often want the villain to be destroyed. My goal was never annihilation. My goal was transparency, accountability, and a rebalancing of the moral ledger. The downfall, then, was that the house of cards they had built, built of perfunctory apologies and gaslighting, couldn't survive the light of raw documentation. Family members who had been willing to pretend were suddenly forced to confront what they'd been pretending to ignore. My parents, faced with the choice between convenience and the truth, could choose convenience and keep pretending that no harm had been done, or they could choose to accept the truth and deal with what that meant. Many of them chose the latter. There was one night, the climax of everything, where my plan felt the most like a victory, not because someone was humiliated, but because the truth had arrived in a room and everyone had to reckon with it. My aunt had agreed to a small, neutral meeting at a community center, not to reconcile, but to talk. I didn't go in hoping for forgiveness. I went in hoping for recognition. I sat across from my mother, my father, my brother, my sister, and Jason. I carried with me a paper copy of the timeline because printed words can't be swiped away. I asked for 5 minutes to speak. I told them, simply and without drama, what I remembered, what I had saved, and why I had left. I read a few passages, the voicemail where Jason explained, the text messages that showed an ongoing closeness between him and my sister, the notes that suggested they'd made decisions together. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I spoke in the same calm voice I'd used at work when asking for a promotion. And something shifted. You could feel it, like a silence after an orchestra drops its instruments. My mother put her face in her hands and wept in a way that wasn't the performance I had seen in previous months. My sister tried to interject, to explain, to apologize. I listened. When she finished, I asked her one question. Did you ever think about me? It was a simple, heartbreaking inquiry that revealed everything. She couldn't answer. She had the kind of flustered, empty apology that didn't address the depth of what she'd done. Jason tried to charm his way through it. He couldn't. There is a limit to charm when you are confronted with the work of your hands laid bare in black and white. After that meeting, the family couldn't easily enroll in the narrative of easy forgiveness. They had to decide, as individuals, how they'd live with what had happened. Some chose to keep seeing my sister at dinner families. Others, like my brother, kept distance. My parents took months to repair anything, and when they tried, it felt half-hearted. The revenge, if we're calling it that, came not from their ruin, but from a kind of moral realignment. The family that had unquestionably gathered around my sister and Jason now had to live with the knowledge that their peace was built on my pain. So what did I gain? Did I feel triumphant? The honest answer is complicated. There was a heady, private satisfaction in seeing people I loved grappling with the evidence. There was also a hollowness in the victory, because the person whose presence I wanted most, my mother hugging me and saying, "I'm sorry we didn't protect you," was rare and precious. My brother's calls were small stitches in a giant rent. Some friends in Minnesota drifted away, uncomfortable with being involved. But something else happened too. I became a person who could occupy a room without needing anyone's permission. I learned how to make a life where my identity wasn't hanging on my position inside someone else's living room. That, my friends, is what you don't always get when you fantasize about revenge. The immediate pleasure of a public humiliation is addictive. The longer pleasure of living well, of being seen as whole and competent and loved on your own terms, that is sustaining. And yes, there were moments of doubt and near relational collapse on my part. I almost texted my father on his birthday because sometimes the urge to patch things is instinctual and immediate. I almost went back to watch my sister at a picnic to see whether she'd miss me. But every time I was tempted, I thought of the woman in my apartment who had learned to manage the city trains and the spreadsheets and the new friendships. I thought of the small sharpness in my body that now belonged to me and no one else.
That quiet, everyday ownership of my life is a revenge of its own. As an author of my own closing chapter, I move forward. I legally changed my last name to my mother's maiden name, which felt like reclaiming a part of me that had been overshadowed. I kept my finances separate, made new holiday traditions, invited friends for Thanksgiving and called it found family. I shared some parts of my story in small online communities in a kind of gentle way that says, "This happened to me, I'm okay now." And the responses poured in. Women and men who had stories of being dismissed by family allegiances, lovers who had been replaced, siblings who had been the other side of a cruel secret. Their messages were the kind of minor revelations that made the whole thing feel less like a private disaster and more like a shared human experience. Would I have preferred my family to simply choose me that Thanksgiving? Yes. Would I have made different choices if I could rewind and rewind again? Maybe I would have tried a different conversation or pushed earlier for honest family therapy. But therapy is only useful if everyone participates honestly, and that expectation was naive. When I blurted out what I had in me at the time, everyone wanted to quiet the noise so they could return to their comfortable seating arrangement. So I took the loudest tool I had left, my absence. And then, when absence felt insufficient, the clarity of the documents I had kept. There was a specific cruelty in that. Exposing someone with their own words is like handing them a mirror. It's kinder than slander, but it's not kind by any usual metric.
Now, when people ask why I did it, I say this. Because sometimes the safest, most moral form of revenge is simply returning the dignity you are denied. I didn't want to be the person who sat politely while people rearranged my life. I wanted to be the person who said, without dramatic flourish, "I see you. I see what you did. I will not let you do this to me anymore." And then I built something that didn't depend on their forgiveness. What would you have done in my shoes? Be honest. Would you have waited this long for payback? Or would you have taken a different path? The reason I ask is because revenge stories tend to be binary in our imaginations. Either the wicked are punished in a single glorious moment, or the wronged person forgives, and everyone goes back to Sunday dinners. Real life is messy. My path included both small victories and quiet, necessary losses. When I look back now, a year later, I see that the narrowness of my old life had been smothering me in ways I didn't fully appreciate until I moved. I discovered tastes I'd never given myself permission to have. I learned that I could stand in a room full of strangers and speak up without checking in with my sister or seeking paternal approval. That kind of growth is not flashy. It is a daily accumulation of small acts of independence. Answering emails late at night and telling a boss your thoughts in a meeting, refusing to eat the foods your parents like because you want to try something new, choosing a partner who looks at your entire life history with compassion rather than consumption. There is still pain sometimes. On the odd Sunday, a song will come on the radio that we used to sing together in the kitchen, and the grief pricks like a paper cut. But those are small things. The wound has a margin now. It doesn't define me. When my mother reaches out, as she still does, though less frequently, I respond with a line that is both a boundary and an invitation. I love you, but I need you to know the truth. Sometimes she replies, sometimes she doesn't. But I sleep now, without waiting for a call that will never come to apologize. The last time I saw my sister was not a showdown. It was a run-in at a family friend's wedding where she and I were both in attendance because my mother had asked everyone to come as an olive branch to the wider circle. She was across the garden looking apprehensive. For a second, we drifted toward each other like two magnets that had once been joined. Her eyes met mine, and there was, for a moment, the complicated flash of recognition that we had, once, been girlhood companions. I chose not to speak. I walked with my arm around the friend I had come with and smiled at strangers. Later that night, my sister posted a photo of the event with a caption about family nights. I didn't like the picture. I didn't comment. If you think that last line is cold, maybe it is. But for me, it has been a kind of final flourish. Not cruel, but reserved. I didn't want to be the person who makes a spectacle of someone else's suffering. I wanted to live with dignity and to choose each day how much of my past I allowed into my present. My revenge was not a dramatic downfall in a court or a viral video. My revenge was quieter and, in some ways, harder to achieve. It was rebuild, claim, and no longer be invisible. So, if you're sitting there thinking about someone who wronged you, wondering whether to stay, to fight, or to rebuild, here's what I would say. Make sure your actions are sustainable. Think about whether your plan will help you sleep at night in the long run. There's a seductive rush to storms. It's harder to keep the light steady. I burned for a while. I learned to channel that heat into work, into new friendships, into the things I had wanted to be for myself all my life. And for anyone who's wondering about consequences, let me be frank. There are always consequences. People will judge you for not suffering nobly. Some will call you cold. Others will envy your liberation. But the most important opinion is yours. When you lay your head down at night, are you comfortable in your skin? Do you know that the choices you make are not guided by the preferences of someone who betrayed you? If the answer is yes, then in my book, you're winning. Do I miss the convenience of family dinners? Sometimes. Do I wish things had been different? Often. Do I regret asserting myself and choosing to leave and to expose what I needed exposed? Not for a second. The trade-offs were heavy. Estrangement and the loss of certain relationships. But the other side of that ledger was a life where I defined myself outside of my betrayal. That, for me, is the long, slow revenge that matters. If you're still with me after all that, and if you're listening because you want to know whether someone can leave and come back stronger, then know this: you can leave. You can tell yourself in the quiet hours that your life isn't over just because your family has been cruel. You can gather the evidence you need, speak plainly to the people who matter, and decide, bravely, whether reconciliation is possible or whether your path forward requires distance. In the end, the person I hurt the least in my revenge was myself, because I chose a path that led to rebuilding rather than destruction. The people who needed to be shown the truth saw it, and they had to live with it. That is not a small thing. So, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have laughed? Would you have stayed? Would you have told the truth in a file or shouted it from a roof? Be honest. Would you have waited this long for payback? Or would you have done something else? There's no single right answer, only the one you can live with. I chose to leave, to expose, and to rebuild. And every morning I wake up and make a coffee in a kitchen that isn't mine. But it is mine in the way that finally earned autonomy is yours because you fought for it and because you decided your life was worth more than their forgiveness on their terms.